A couple of weeks ago I FDM printed this demon miniature, showing my process for slicing, printing, and cleaning up this model. And today we're going to get this mini ready for painting, with the ever crucial step of priming. But I won't just be priming this one model today. No, today we're going to be priming 6 miniatures, using the 3 different methods that I most often use to prime FDM miniatures, so that you can see my processes and judge what will work best for you. We'll start off by taking a look at the method that I most commonly use here on the channel, an airbrushing process that you're quite likely familiar with. But we'll also be taking a look at a more accessible, no extra gear required option, as well as a quick and dirty option for painting up big models or large armies. I'm Jacob from Painted for Combat, and let's get into it. As mentioned, we'll first be taking a look at the classic Airbrush Prime that you've probably seen me do a bunch of times by now. Into the airbrush cup goes Army Painter Matte Black Air Primer. But these FDM minis are printed in a somewhat porous PLA, and can sometimes absorb and spread paint if the primer on top is too matte. To combat this, I also add in a few drops of gloss varnish and an equal part of water to the cup. I'm probably using about 10 parts primer to 1 part gloss varnish and 1 part water for this mixture. The gloss varnish helps the surface to dry a little bit more satin, rather than matte, and stops the later layers of paint being absorbed through the primer and pulled into the PLA underneath. Then I go back covering the model with 2 coats. My first layer is always a lighter dusting over the whole model, not too worried about getting all the nooks and crannies, but enough that the model looks about 80% covered. And I'll do this across however many models I'm painting. Once all the models are coated with this first layer, and are dry to the touch, I'll do another coat, starting by carefully picking out the hard to reach areas and recesses that won't easily get hit. And then once again going over the whole model. Not even being too worried about keeping the layer thin. I want to make sure that every millimeter of this model has a generous helping of primer. Not so much that paint starts pooling or flowing down the model, but just enough that some of this primer can seep into a few of those FDM layer lines before the model fully dries. I find that having the slightly thicker coat of primer just allows us to fill in and hide a few of those last few FDM layer lines. And given some time to dry, we have 2 well-primed models ready for some paint. The satin finish is amazing when it comes time to paint. It still grips paint like a matte primer, but retains the protective properties of a gloss coat. As seen on the channel, this priming method is my go-to for large models or big batches of minis. It's fast, efficient, and works well enough, while still giving you a good amount of control over just how much primer you're putting on your mini. But what if you just want to prime 1 or 2 small miniatures, without then having to clean an airbrush? Well, in that case, let's use this same Army Painter Air Primer, in a slightly different way, using tools that you almost definitely already have. This is my go-to method for one-off minis, when I just want to sit down and get a model painted up fast, usually for my D&D campaign, using a brush, our bottle of primer, and some black paint. For the first layer, I simply use this primer straight from the bottle. The pre-thin consistency, designed for airbrushes, is also perfect for brushing on as it's thin enough not to clog up details. And I use a pretty big brush for this, making sure to get paint on the whole model, but not worrying too much about getting full total coverage. This paint is just thin enough that you won't necessarily get a solid black coat on the first layer. In fact, as this primer dries, it almost starts to look closer to a layer of speed paint. And you want to make sure that you're being liberal enough to coat this whole model, but not so much that you're letting this thin paint pool. I often come in with an empty brush if I need to soak up any excess paint. Now, once these models have had enough time to dry to the touch, we'll come in with our second layer. This is what's going to give us our full black coverage and slightly more satin finish. For this, I mix up 4 parts of our Army Painter Primer to 1 part Army Painter Fanatic Black. The Fanatic line of paints are highly pigmented though, so if you're not using Army Painter Fanatic, maybe try 2 parts of black paint in your mix instead. And now, with that mixed up, we have a slightly thicker primer for our second layer. I load my brush with just enough paint to cover, but not pool on the model, and then I almost scrub this across the miniature, which helps to make sure that I'm getting even coverage across all areas of the mini, getting the same amount of paint in the recesses as I am on the surface details. I make sure to apply a generous coat of this across each model, once again soaking up any excess paint once you're done. This method is super easy, doesn't require the maintenance of an airbrush, and because of our thicker paint mixture and ability to get a more even second coat, we were able to hide even more layer lines than we did with the airbrush, and with an even nicer satin surface finish. And this is my favourite priming method to actually paint on. I find that painting your first colours over a base that contains that same paint is a much smoother experience than painting directly on some primers. But with these two priming methods out of the way, what if you have a huge army, or a model that is simply too big to prime with the airbrush? Well then, maybe the trusty Rattle-Can Prime is for you. If you're enjoying this video so far, or you found it useful in any way, please consider subscribing down below. It helps the channel to grow and reach new people. And if you want to help further support what I do, Patreon is the single best way to do so. Where for just a couple of bucks you can get access to the Painted for Combat community Discord, as well as my various printer profile downloads. Or at the higher tiers, get access to monthly sculpted bases, like this month's release, The Cursed Swamps. Awesome swampy marshland bases, designed specifically to print on FDM printers with no supports required, that are available plain or with pre-added mushrooms. Or you can print off these basing bits and add them yourself, so that no two bases ever have to be quite the same. And a huge thank you to my generous Painted for Display tier members, whose support means so much to the longevity of this channel. And to our newest member of this tier, Jesus Christ, whose badge will now forever be on the display shelf. A huge thank you to all of my patrons for your wonderful support. Let's get back to it. Personally, I use Rattle-Can priming mostly on terrain and bases, as it covers big areas fast. But on occasion, if I want to get a few minis primed in a matter of seconds without having to set up or clean the airbrush, this is great. Personally, I like the Rust-Oleum 2x matte range for Rattle-Can priming, though I do find that sometimes it's hard to tell just how matte it will be. Sometimes I'll prime a model and it will be similar in sheen to a hand-primed model, and sometimes the model will end up with a high-gloss candy shell coating. This is probably due to the model's distance from the can, or how long I shook it, or something like that, I never quite know. But after a good shake, much the same as with our Airbrush Prime, I do a once-over lightly, hitting the whole model from a good distance, to cover about 70 to 80% of the Mini. Not worrying too much about hitting every angle or getting every recess, I'm just looking for a starting coverage. After letting that set up and dry a little bit, I come in with a second coat, hitting the model from any angles that I might have missed the first time, then trying to get some coverage in any of the hard-to-reach recesses. Then finally giving a spray over any of the other areas that haven't yet been hit with the second layer. Given how fast paint comes out of these rattle cans, I find it best to prime in quick bursts. Hitting an area, moving the model slightly, hitting it again, and so on. I try to never spray in the exact same spot twice, to try and avoid too much paint building up. That said, on the second layer, I'm not overly concerned about it getting a little bit heavy. You shouldn't have paint flowing between areas or dripping off of the model, but a generous coat, evenly across the model, will give you a great finish. Even if you think that your layer is a little bit thick and that you've clogged up details, give it some time to dry. This aerosol paint evaporates a lot, and will reveal a lot more of the model than you might first think. So, while Rattle-Can priming can make it a little bit tricky to figure out how matte or glossy your finish will be, and makes getting into some of the recesses a little bit more difficult, it's a simple and hassle-free way to prime your models, and allows you to tear through armies or large miniatures, without the hassle of brushing it on or cleaning an airbrush. So these have been the 3 best ways that I have found to prime my FDM miniatures. Each of them has their own pros and cons, favouring speed, control, ease of use, or accessibility, but overall these are great methods to prime your FDM minis. They give you a good surface coat to work up from, and they help to hide some of those FDM layer lines. Let me know down below if you have a different method for priming your FDM minis that you think is better or works better for you. Like if you liked, and subscribe to keep up to date with future projects here on the channel. But most importantly, thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a good one.